my great pleasure to introduce Grace, who is going to say a few words. And she has really single-handedly done amazing work in her own community over the last few months. And it's been really fun for me to get to know her. And she's just done such amazing work, and she's really why we're all here tonight. So I'd like her to introduce herself a little bit further and talk about the project she's working on, and then we'll get into the invasive species stuff.
Hi everyone, my name is Grace Nombrado. Thank you, Tasha, for helping facilitate this session today. As she mentioned, I'm the founder of Free the Fern. It's a community stewardship group in South Vancouver. So back in January, there was a windstorm and I was outside cleaning up some fallen branches in a trail called Champlain Heights Trail that's behind my co-op. And as I was gathering up the branches, I looked around and noticed that there were a lot of invasives that were taking over the area around my co-op. So I made it a commitment to work on removing the invasives within my area of the trail. I spent many hours out there working on the trails, removing ivy, Himalayan blackberry, common periwinkle, and a lot of other invasives. And when I was out there, I was actually meeting people along the trails who were walking along the trail. And I connected with 14 other individuals who live along the trail and want to make a difference. And together we formed the group Free the Fern. So since January, we've succeeded in removing over 6,000 pounds worth of invasives along the trail there. And we've also are working on creating a native plant teaching garden for our area. And this Zoom education has been brought to you by a small neighborhood grant. And we hope that each of you can take away some knowledge from this session and that you can use this knowledge to make a difference within your own community that you're coming from. So thank you, Tasha, and I'll let you take it over now.
Sure, thank you so much. So yeah, let's get started again. So I think everybody's in the right place. You're here ready to learn about invasive species. And just a disclaimer, so I work in the Metro Vancouver region, and largely the species that we're going to be focusing on today and some of the management activities are local to the Metro Vancouver region. Of course, I hope even if you're outside of the Metro Vancouver region that you'll take away some key messages, but I'll be sharing some information throughout about how you can connect with somebody just like me in whatever region you're working in. So here's what I'm going to cover tonight. I'm going to cover what is an invasive species. When we use that term, what are we actually talking about? I'm going to talk about some of the risks that they pose, so their impacts, and then I'm going to spend the bulk of the session talking about some of our really common local plants in Metro Vancouver, so some invasive, but a few native plants as well. And then we'll review kind of what's being done, who's actually doing the work of managing invasive species. And then finally, I'll end with some tips and some resources that I hope will help in the work that you're doing, whether you are a homeowner or a gardener or a stewardship volunteer like Grace, or if you're just an interested member of the community. And also just a note, I mentioned that the recording will be available to you afterwards. So Grace will send a message to everybody who's registered with that link to the recording, as well as all the links that I'm going to share. I'm going to mention a number of different resources and things that I recommend that might help your work. So you can copy those links down now, or just remember they'll be coming in an email later as well. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So what is an invasive species? In order to meet that definition, you really have to be two things. You have to be from somewhere else on Earth. So you have not evolved in Metro Vancouver. You're either from another continent or perhaps the other side of the continent. And really this whole phenomenon of invasive species exists because humans have moved things around that otherwise wouldn't have been able to move so far. So we expect that all living things have a natural range or a place that they live on Earth, and that changes a bit over time. But the invasive species that we see here in Metro Vancouver, there's no way they could have got here on their own. It's because humans have intentionally or not intentionally moved things from one part of the world to another. So you have to be from somewhere else on Earth. And when you're introduced into your new habitat, you also have to be causing some significant harm. And that's the definition of an invasive species. And we're going to be focusing on plants today, but really any living thing has the potential to be invasive. Insects, We sometimes deal with invasive insects in Metro Vancouver, eastern gray squirrel, American bullfrog, other great examples of invasive wildlife. But plants are a lot of what folks focus on when they're dealing with invasives. But what's a weed? So my definition of a weed is a bit broader than an invasive plant. A weed could be something growing where you don't want it to grow. So there's a bit of value in that, because what you want growing on your property or your patio might be different than what somebody else wants. And sometimes I get questions from people saying, you know, I don't want this certain plant on my property, even though it's a native plant. So for whatever reason, if it's not something that they desire for their property, then they would consider it a weed and they would like to get rid of it. But sometimes people use the words weeds interchangeably with invasive species, but there's a little bit of a difference. So this is my diagram to summarize how we categorize species or plants. So plants can be native, which means they've lived in a certain place on Earth for a long period of time, and they're living harmoniously with other plants and funguses and other living things in that ecosystem. Or things can be non-native. Again, these are species that have been introduced from somewhere else on Earth. Sometimes we also use the terms alien or exotic. And really a lot of what we maintain in our gardens and a lot of what you can buy in garden centers would fall under the category of non-invasive, non-native plants. So there's a picture of palm trees there, but pretty much everything that I have in my veggie garden are non-invasive, non-native plants, right? Tomatoes and celery, those are things that don't naturally grow in BC. And same with a lot of the garden plants that we plant, tulips and all sorts of things. And so there's a large percentage of plants that are non-native, but they're also non-invasive. It's just really a small percentage of plants that are non-native, that are invasive and that are doing harm, that we're really focusing on managing. And so when we think about the impacts of invasive, we kind of think of three main categories. The first one is ecological or environmental. And so invasive species across the board have huge environmental impacts worldwide. One of the first being they displace the native plants that require this specific habitat to grow in. So invasive species to Metro Vancouver often can grow really quickly, and they simply outcompete our native plants for resources and space. You can see some photos there of some invasive species that are just completely taken over. Sometimes that's a clue that there might be an invasive species at a site, is if there's one kind of dominant species that's sort of taking over everything else. That's often the case with an invasive plant. In our region, in our sort of rain coast environment, we expect a large number of species that live in wetlands and forests and grasslands, and invasive species really prevent that kind of biodiversity and a large number of species growing together. Health and safety, so these are actually photos of people who have been injured by a plant called giant hogweed, which we have in Metro Vancouver. It's an invasive plant that's actually really toxic. And so some of our invaders are actually posing a health and safety issue. And there's also some indirect safety issues if plants are growing onto a highway or growing through infrastructure. Those can cause safety problems as well. And then finally, there's an economic impact for invasive species. They are impacting pretty much every sector that we rely on here in BC: fishing, aquaculture, forestry, agriculture, tourism, mining. All of these sectors have to manage invasive species in order to do their work in one way or another. Here you can see some photos of knotweed growing through infrastructure, and that's one of the direct economic impacts, is that it costs money for people to manage these things. And really all levels of government, and including private community citizens, are spending time and money dealing with invasives. In Metro Vancouver, a conservative estimate on a yearly basis is probably a couple $1 million is spent simply managing these things. And so it's really a burden on everybody, whether they know it or not, to be managing invasive species, because their tax dollars at minimum are going to support some of these programs. So where do they come from? Unfortunately, many of our invasive plants have come through the horticulture industry. So there's a bit of a disconnect in the legislation, and many of the plants I'm going to talk about tonight, you could buy in your local nursery or garden center. And so that's why we like to provide education, is because plants like this are still available for sale, but we want people to make good choices for their garden and for the environment. Really any way that humans move around, whether we're hiking or biking or using an all-terrain vehicle, we could potentially be moving invasive plant parts or seeds. If you have invasive plants in your garden, just like this little townhome development here, the invasive plants could literally escape from your yard and begin impacting a natural area right next door. Sometimes our own maintenance activities, so regular work of government, maintaining trails and roadsides, some of those activities can actually further the spread of invasive plants. And so we've got some training programs in place to train people who work on the ground so they know what to watch out for and they know what to do and what not to do around particular invaders. So some of the control methods that we use to manage invasive plants, you're probably familiar with manual or mechanical control. That's physically removing or killing plants. So if you're weeding in your garden, you are undertaking manual control. Mechanical control is the use of machines. So maybe you've got some kind of brush saw or weed eater, and that can do the job as well. You can see a picture of a woman removing Scotch broom there. That's special tool that she's using to conduct manual control on that plant. And manual control is largely what stewards and volunteers are doing on the ground. They're doing kind of that grunt work with their hands, getting in there and removing these things. Chemical control is another option. It's the use of herbicides or chemicals to kill plants, and there's lots of different ways that that is done as well. And for some of our more challenging invasive plants for which we don't have a lot of other options, chemical control is often used as a last resort. Biological control is also possible. This is largely managed by government. So it's the introduction of a host-specific predator, usually some kind of insect that will specifically feed on the target invasive plant. So in particular situations for a few of our invasive plants, biological control is a really useful tool as well. And then finally, there's cultural control, which is essentially changing the way that humans use plants or use the earth to make it, or to minimize the impact of invasive species. So it could be as simple as maintaining your property in such a way that you're discouraging invasive plants from coming in. It could also be repurposing invasive species. The photo on the bottom there is from the Urban Weaver Project, which is just one example of a really creative way that local artists are repurposing invasive plant materials. So they're using things like blackberry canes and ivy vines to create baskets and musical instruments and fibers. And so that's a really great way to use up some of that invasive plant material, as well as providing a really unique education opportunity to share with the public about the issue of invasive species. So next I'm going to cover some of the usual suspects. So again, focusing on plants that you'd find very easily in the Metro Vancouver region, plants that you probably might be able to look out your window and see right now. And so before we do that, I just wanted to mention that one of the best resources that I'll focus on today is some best management guides for some of the high priority species in Metro Vancouver. And you can find these documents if you go to metrovancouver.org and search invasive species. Some of you might want to follow along as we go through some of the plants, and you can actually go through some of those documents, because it does matter what species you're working on. It does matter what kind of practices you're deciding on, depending what species you have. We know that certain things will work on certain species and other practices are not recommended for certain plants. So I really encourage you to check those out. Pretty much most of the species I'm going to cover today, we have best management guides for. And so those are great resources to start with. So I'm going to start with blackberry, which is probably the most widespread invasive plant we have in Metro Vancouver. This is the one that probably many of us could look out our window right now and see a patch of blackberry somewhere. It's so widespread. And so how blackberry grows is starts from a seed, and then the seed will form a little plant, and then the plant produces these kind of swooping canes. And if the end of a cane or a stem reaches the ground, it can spread roots again. And so you kind of have this effect where one plant very quickly gets very large, and they form these large thickets like you can see on the second photo there, where often all you have is blackberry, some dead canes underneath and some living canes over top. Blackberry does have some cultural value. There are a few wildlife species that will use blackberry, but not nearly the same number or quantity of species that will use a native intact ecosystem with a number of different species. Humans also like blackberries, right? People like to collect the juicy blackberries late in the summer season, and I totally support the collection and eating of blackberries. That's really a form of cultural control. The more we eat, the less blackberries are going to be dropped in nature and produce new plants. And so some of the best strategies for dealing with blackberry are if you're not able to manage it on a regular basis, which is often the case with parks. Sometimes people are just, trimming it, cutting it back once or twice a year. If you want to actually get rid of the blackberry once and for all, the best strategy is really to remove the root crown, which is kind of a gnarly woody mass that's fairly superficial in the ground. You need to use a pickaxe or a shovel or something like that to try and remove as much of that woody material and as much of the roots as possible. And so with that hand pulling and when you're digging and grubbing those roots out of the ground, that's where you're going to have the most success getting rid of the blackberry. And just a note, I'm going to have a slide a little bit later on how to dispose of this stuff. What do you do once you've dug it up or cut it up? And again, it's a little bit specific depending on what species you're dealing with, but I'm going to talk about disposal kind of at the end. So those are kind of the best strategies for dealing with blackberry. I'll also note that the Himalayan blackberry is the most common, but we also have another invasive blackberry called evergreen blackberry or cutleaf blackberry. We also have a native blackberry as well. So a few different types of blackberries, but the Himalayan is probably the most common one you'll see. And just like in the photo there, it likes full sun, so it doesn't tend to grow in the middle of a forest. You'll often see it on the perimeter of a forest or along trails where it can get a lot of sun. And this is a plant that is the bane of a lot of gardeners and a lot of stewardship groups. It is difficult to remove, but the thorns are what make it really challenging. So you really have to protect yourself well, because as you know, if you've handled dead or living blackberry canes, they have really sharp thorns that penetrate sometimes even the best leather gloves. And so you need to really be prepared when you're working on blackberry. All right, moving on. So English and Irish ivy. So before I worked on the best management guide for ivy, I was calling all of the regions ivy, English ivy, but it turns out we actually have English and Irish ivy. It doesn't really matter which species you're dealing with, you manage them in very similar ways, and you'd actually need a microscope or a hand lens to look underneath the leaves of the ivy to distinguish between the two species. So I'm in the habit now of just calling it ivy. And so the challenge with ivy, it's a ground cover, it grows along the ground, but its whole mission in life is to get vertical. So it wants to grow up a tree or a pole or a structure of some sort. And that's where you want to prioritize your time. You want to keep the ivy off of those structures, especially trees. Ivy is really damaging to trees. It doesn't actually penetrate the tree bark, but it can impact the health of the tree in a number of different ways. In the photo here, that tree that I'm circling on the left here, you can see that the ivy is pretty much covering all around the bark of the tree, and that makes the tree more susceptible to rotting and to diseases and to pests. Also, just the sheer amount of ivy that grows in trees can make it more susceptible for trees or branches coming down, especially in a big storm. The ivy leaves are evergreen, which means they stay on the plant year round. And so especially if the tree is a deciduous tree and the tree loses its leaves, those ivy leaves high up in the branches can kind of act like little sails. And we have a lot of trees come down in strong winds in the wintertime that is made worse if they're infested with the English ivy. So definitely you want to get the ivy off the trees first. And the best way to do that is to create what some people call a lifesaver ring. So essentially you're cutting the ivy vines at around chest height, and then you're stripping the ivy down from the tree around the ground. And any of that stuff that you've cut above chest height, you actually don't need to pull off the tree. In fact, you shouldn't. That would come at great risk of things falling on your head, and it can actually really damage the tree as well. Once you've severed the connection of the ivy from the roots, then all that stuff will eventually decompose and die that's in the upper canopy of the tree. And so again, you want to be stripping around down. You want to give at least a couple meter buffer around the tree if possible, and of course remove as much of the ivy that's on the ground as possible, and just be watching for it every year, because the ivy, if it still persists on the ground, it'll continue working its way towards the trees and will want to continue growing up in that direction. So fortunately, manual control is a really successful way to manage the ivy, and it's a great plant for volunteers to be working on. There are volunteers that are working year-round on ivy in some of our protected areas and parks in Metro Vancouver, and you can have really good success. One of our large stewardship groups is the Stanley Park Ecology Society, which of course works in Stanley Park, and a number of years ago they hit a milestone of having removed all of the tree ivy in the park, and so they're now just working on a few spots where there's still some ivy on the ground, but they totally used the right approach and saved the trees first. All right, English holly is really kind of an up and coming invader in Metro Vancouver. I think for a lot of years it kind of sat under the radar and people weren't thinking that it was very destructive, but just like the English and Irish ivy that we just covered, English holly can be spread by birds. So there are a few bird species that will eat the berries and then they will poop out the seeds. And so that's one of the ways that the holly and the ivies are spreading around. And I have literally been bushwhacking in very rural and pristine areas in Metro Vancouver, and I've come across holly that was, quite far from, the nearest holly patch. And so we do find that birds are helping to spread the holly around, and it is starting to impact some of our old growth forests. And so it's especially problematic on the North Shore, but holly is fairly common in a lot of forests within the region. And so it's a species that I'm really trying to draw people's attention to. So with small to medium-sized holly plants and smaller infestations, you can have success with pulling or digging. One thing that I find with holly is that it can sucker, and so oftentimes you find that you're pulling out a piece of holly and then it's actually attached to another plant that was kind of growing in the ground, and suddenly the individual holly is a lot bigger than you thought. It's a shrub, but it can get to be a tree size, and it's really challenging when you get a holly tree, because you really would require a professional to remove it if it was larger than a couple of centimeters in diameter. And so, yeah, holly is another one that I really encourage people to kind of remove and watch and pull it out when it's really young, and watch for it in local parks and even in your backyard, because it does spread really easily. So yellow archangel, sometimes called lamium or Lamiastrum, is one of these plants that is readily available in garden centers. It's a very common hanging basket plant. So if you buy a ready-made hanging basket, often they'll put in yellow archangel because it sort of trails nicely out of the bin. And people like the look of it. It has what we call variegated leaves, where the tips kind of look a little bit frosted. And just like the English ivy, which is also a ground cover, yellow archangel will be evergreen all year round. So it'll look like that in the forest throughout the year. And in most places, in Metro Vancouver where we have yellow Archangel. Usually at ground zero, there's the remnants of an illegal dumping site or a hanging basket, or there's a lot of infestation adjacent to residential properties where people have illegally dumped their yard waste in the backyard thinking that that was okay. And then if they had lamium in there, then it would just simply, spread in that natural area. So it's another one that you can control manually, just hand removal of sites that are kind of less than 5 meters squared. It becomes a lot more challenging if you have a larger site, because if you've ever tried to remove this, you know that there are roots like every few square centimeters. So it's very, very picky business trying to remove all of the plant, and you really want to try and get out as much of the root material as you can. This time of year, yellow Archangel is flowering. I just took some pictures of it a few days ago. So it is actually a member of the mint family. So it's got those square stems, just like a lot of our mint plants do. And it's got these little yellow sort of like hooded flowers that you will see. But the leaves you'll see all throughout the year. People that have options to use mechanical tools, you can use some of those things to maybe mow or to try and till the soil, but that's really challenging in natural areas where you might be working around ferns or other native plants that you want to save. Yeah, just to note, the nature of these invasive species is that they're not easy to remove. I think sometimes people look to me and people like me for like the silver bullet answer, and the nature of these invaders is that they're not easy to remove. Otherwise, I wouldn't have this job. It'd be easy for everybody to know what to do, but they're all really challenging, and in some cases, it's almost impossible to remove all of these species from a site, even though we put good effort forth. Periwinkle, very similar to Lamiastrum. It's an evergreen kind of ground cover. In my old house, this was one of my nemesis species. I would remove it every year, and then it would kind of go away for a year or two, and then I'd see a little piece of periwinkle popping up. And unfortunately, this plant is still readily sold. The flower is kind of small. It's blown up on the photo there, but you can see that beautiful periwinkle color, which is one of the reasons why people are attracted to purchasing this plant. They love those flowers and they want that kind of evergreen look. And again, manual control is really the best way to be working on periwinkle. So pulling it out, getting as much of the root material out as you can. And then we're going to talk a little bit later on about how you can do some restoration to prevent invaders from coming back to the site that you've been working at. Hedge bindweed is a really tough one. That was one of the latest best management guides that I was working on over the winter. And hedge bindweed is also called morning glory, although just a note that morning glory can also refer to other similar plants. So when you're using common names, sometimes you have to make sure that you're talking about the same plant. In this case, the hedge bindweed is the one that's commonly found growing around other things, fences, other plants, trees, hedges. And it's a really common one that people are dealing with in their own, private properties. But unfortunately, it's also really common also at restoration sites. So the photo on the left here, it's a bit dark, but that thing underneath that mound of hedge bindweed is actually a plant. So this was a planting site where a couple months earlier, some volunteers had put some plants into the ground. And oftentimes when you're disturbing the ground a little bit, even though you're putting native plants in, that's an opportunity for hedge bindweed and other invaders to kind of start growing more aggressively. And that's unfortunately what happened at the site. And hedge bindweed actually twines around things. So it's not as simple as just yanking it off, because you could actually do damage if the plant underneath is something that you want to save at the site. And so other distinguishing features of hedge bindweed, you can see those sort of large white trumpet-like flowers that actually close during the nighttime. You can see the closed, the flower up top there. And so, yeah, my best advice for managing hedge bindweed is really to just pull it as often as you can when you see it first coming up. And in my yard, I'm a big gardener, and as of a couple months ago, I started watching this pop up, and you pull a lot of it out and you dig down really deep and you think you got all of the root or the underground rhizomes, which is the way that they're spreading laterally underground. But still, any little piece that you leave in the soil can propagate a new plant. So it's really almost impossible to remove hedge bindweed from a site entirely. I'm convinced that I'll always be working on it in my yard, in my veggie garden, and I've got a small little orchard with some fruit trees, and the hedge bindweed just loves to grow up there. So I'm just trying to get out there every week or two to pull it as much as I can. And if it got to the point where it did start to flower, you can also pull the flowers off as kind of a stopgap measure, because at least then they won't be able to go to seed, even if you don't have opportunity to remove all of the vegetation at the time. I also wanted to mention knotweed. It's not likely a species that volunteers would be working on, and hopefully you don't have this on your own property if you have a home or property that you're managing. But knotweeds are probably the highest priority species for management in Metro Vancouver, and so I did want to cover them briefly. So we actually have 4 species of knotweed in the region. They look a lot like bamboo, but they're not bamboo. They're a whole other kind of beast. And they're challenging because they spread really easily. They spread by any small portion of the leaves or the stems or the roots or the rhizomes. And they're also notoriously difficult to control. And so anybody who has knotweed on their property has to take into account considerations that managing it with manual control or mechanical control is actually not recommended. Sometimes doing so will actually cause the plant to come back more aggressively, and also it comes at a greater risk of spreading the plant. So if you're chopping a bunch of the stems down and then leaving them on site, or maybe you got a little bit on your clippers, those little pieces could potentially, grow into new plants. And so for that reason, the best advice that we have for anybody who has knotweed that they're managing is to use some sort of chemical control or herbicide as part of the management plan. And that's largely what local governments and First Nations and provincial government are doing with knotweed in the region. They're using some sort of herbicide regime. And so people with pesticide applicator licenses and lots of training are managing the knotweed. So you can see some of the damage that knotweed can do. It will really grow through anything. You can see that it's kind of growing very close to a foundation right here. And if you can see in the photo, those little white bits. So this is a downspout, and somebody had built some kind of wood protection for the downspout, and there had been a top over that as well. But even without access to the sun, with the top on that section, you can see the knotweed was still able to grow. So this stuff is just amazing. Even after a site appears to have been eradicated or completely managed, we've had cases where year 3, year 4, people are going back to monitor the site and knotweed pops up, a few meters from the original infestation. So the underground structure of this plant is just absolutely amazing. And so it's really, really difficult to get rid of it. So that's kind of the story about knotweed. If you've heard about knotweed, and if you've seen maybe some treatment signs or some sites in your neighborhood, you'll know that that's what's happening to try and get rid of it. So besides the ones that I covered in more detail today, there are unfortunately so many more. There are really hundreds of invasive plants that we deal with in the province. Some of the other priority species I've listed here: yellow flag iris, spurge laurel, Himalayan balsam, common tansy. Giant hogweed is the one that I mentioned that is highly toxic, and then Scotch broom. So some of these are more common in natural areas or along roadsides, but some of them might grow in your garden or areas where you're working as well. So again, my best advice is to know what plant you're dealing with and then find resources on how best to manage it. And then the restoration piece. So again, the nature of invasive species is they're extremely aggressive, and they will continue to grow and fight as hard as they can to take over. And so it's really not just a one-time management activity. It's usually a really long-term commitment. And so oftentimes multiple times a year, you might have to be going back, and then you might have to be going back multiple years as well. And so after we've done removal efforts, oftentimes we want to really take care of the site and ensure that the same invasive plant or different invaders or weeds don't come back. And so it's often a great idea to do a restoration planting. Sometimes the sites that we're working at, if it's a really small patch of knotweed or something, oftentimes restoration is not necessary. If there are already native healthy plants at the site, they often will be able to kind of restart once you've removed the invader. But often in places where stewards are working, you do want to follow up with the restoration planting. So you do need to consider the time of year. Usually the moist times of year, so spring or even fall is better. Not a great idea to be planting in the middle of the summer because your brand new plants want water and you don't want them to die really quickly after you planted them. You also want to choose your plants carefully. So a really great piece of advice is what's already growing at the site and doing well, and maybe use some of those native plants, and nature will give you a clue about what's going to likely survive. And then again, have a monitoring plan. So you want to make sure that you protect your newly installed plants from invaders coming back, especially because we know that some hedge bindweed and some of those other species actually do really well after the soil's been disturbed a little bit, after you've done a planting and volunteers have been in there trying to remove some of that stuff. And whenever you're doing a planting, hopefully there's somebody there to give you some instruction, but the general gist is that you're digging a hole slightly larger than the potted plant that you have, and then you can carefully remove your potted plant, and depending how old it is, you might see some roots kind of growing around that the potted soil, and so you can kind of break that up a little bit and make it easier for the roots to spread out once you pop it into the hole. And then once it's in the hole, you can put the soil back in, and if you have opportunity to supplement it with some great soil or even some mulch, that's one of the ways that you can help encourage the growth and also suppress some of those invasive plants and weeds. And so, yeah, one of the resources that I'll share with you is my YouTube channel. And last year we did a little short video on how to actually plant. So there's a picture of me or video of me in Central Park actually demonstrating how to put a plant into the ground. So that's might be helpful if you're going to be doing that. I did want to cover some native plants because I get tired of talking about the bad plants, and so I want to talk about some of the good plants that you could potentially include in a restoration project. And these are also plants that you would readily find in natural areas in the region. So sword fern, I love the Free the Fern name, and so one of the namesakes of that organization is the native sword fern, and it's a lovely, lovely plant. I have some in my yard, and it's just a great plant that I love to see growing in our forests. Salal, which is another native plant that's often used in floral arrangements. It's a shrub that you often find in the understory of our native forest. And you can see in the photo there that there's some unripe berries. So they have these little cute kind of bell-shaped flowers, and then the berries will form, and then they'll turn a little bit darker during the fall season. And the berries are actually edible for salal. Some people don't like the taste. They're not as sweet as some of our other berries, but it's definitely a native plant that is edible. And of course, salmonberry, one of my favorites. It's a great alternative in areas where you might have removed some of the invasive blackberry. And so this is a nice shrub, and it's a great time to be identifying salmonberry this time of year because it's flowering, and then it will produce berries that are sort of similar to blackberries, those kind of aggregate fruits, but the salmonberries tend to be kind of more salmon colored or pinkish colored, and they're completely edible and delicious as well. So what's being done? So I know many of you are involved in work in your communities and in your yards, but who's really responsible for doing all of the work of managing all of these invasives? So a little bit about my work. I'm actually one of several invasive species councils that exist throughout BC. So I represent the Metro Vancouver region, small little bit on the south coast, but there are people just like me in the rest of the province. And for those of you who are joining us from outside Metro Vancouver, I can get you in touch with all the awesome people who do very similar work to me in the province. And we're all sort of working towards the same mission, although we deal with different plants and different partners depending where we're from. And really the goal of my organization is to improve the way we manage invasive plants in Metro Vancouver. I feel like a big part of my job is to help everybody else who's managing invaders do their job a little bit better. So I answer a lot of questions. I do presentations and do a lot of training with government staff and volunteers. And we also have a small seasonal field crew that kind of specializes in some of our priority and challenging plants. So besides me, who are the main players in the region? The provincial government definitely has a role to play. We've got a few provincial parks and other provincial areas, and they're also funding a lot of the work that I do and my counterparts do in the province. The regional government has a role to play for managing their own parks and spaces, and they also sort of take a leadership role on disposal. So they're largely in charge of a lot of the industrial composting facilities where all of our yard waste goes. And so they've been kind of helping to figure out, where we can send all of this invasive stuff so that we're sure it's not going to spread further. Municipal governments, local governments definitely have a large role to play. They're doing tons of work on the ground, whether it's their own staff or whether they're hiring contractors to do work in local parks. Utilities, industry and transportation agencies, whether they own or lease land, are also responsible for managing invasive species. The horticulture industry I picked on a little bit today because I mentioned that many of our invaders are actually available for sale and are readily grown and sold. But there are lots of good allies as well, lots of good growers and retailers who know about the issue and who are making good choices and helping the public to make good choices as well. Academic institutions are training students in how to manage invasive species, and there's a lot more opportunities now than when I was in university to even specialize in this as a field. Private landowners are probably the most diverse in terms of their response to invasive species. So there are folks like you who probably already have some basic knowledge and wanted to learn more, so thumbs up to you. But there are a lot of other folks that have no idea that not every plant is beneficial for the environment or for yards. Contractors and environmental professionals are doing a lot of the work on the ground, everything from active management to research to planning, and to assessments, environmental assessments. And then stewardship groups and other not-for-profit organizations really fill in so many of the gaps. Folks like Grace and other volunteers who are on the session today who've taken it upon themselves to steward an area that some of these other players just don't have capacity to do. And really in the south coast of BC, there's so much great work happening all by volunteers, which is really amazing. You guys are one of my favorite people to work with because the effort that you put forth and the enthusiasm is just so inspiring. So I think now Larissa is going to open up the chat. So if you do have some burning questions, you can pop those into the chat for us to address in a few moments. But I did want to end with some tips and share some things that might help with your role, whether you're a steward or a gardener or a homeowner or just an all-around awesome informed people that you are. So I encourage you to practice your plant identification. So you guys are already attending a workshop, yay. There are other opportunities for guided walks. Some of those programs have scaled back a little bit with COVID, but there are opportunities in most neighborhoods and communities to go on guided walks with an expert where you can learn more about what's happening in your neighborhood. Make friends with a plant person. If you know somebody who knows their plants, go on a walk with them. I find for me, I really have to see a plant in person in real life to be able to confidently identify it. You know, photos and books are really great, but to see it in real life is really helpful. I also encourage you to learn to recognize plants in all growth stages. get to know what the plants look like throughout the season. So this is a picture of giant hogweed here, which is much easier to identify when it is mature and flowering, but a lot more difficult to identify this time of year when it's just popping up through the ground. So you can actually learn a lot by just paying attention to what the plants look like throughout the year. And even when they're dead, I do a lot of plant ID with dead photos. Or during the winter, I'm looking for, old berries or seeds, or what do the leaves look like from last year, and you can actually learn a lot. And then I'm hoping that you can also be on the lookout for invasive plants and can help identify some things that need to be taken care of. So in your local neighborhood, you can report directly to whoever is responsible for the area, or you can contact a local expert like myself and send reports to me. Or there are a couple of free reporting apps that you can download wherever you get your apps from. There's a Report Invasives BC app and also a Report-A-Weed. They're basically the same thing. The Report-A-Weed will only cover plants though. And so using your smartphone, you can actually in real time submit an invasive plant report that gets sent to the province, and then it gets sort of trickled down and sent to those of us who work at the local level. And so those apps are really helpful. They also have photos of all the invasive plants. So if you're wondering if, say, that orange hawkweed that's on the slide there, if you're wondering if that's really the plant you were looking at, you could pull up the orange hawkweed profile and look at some photos and then decide whether that's actually what you're looking at or not, and then submit your report right there. You can even add photos to your report. And then the coordinates are captured, which are super important for people like me who might need to go back to the site. Other considerations for outdoor work. So of course, you need permission from the landowner. If that is not you, before you do any work in a public park or any outdoor natural area, you need to have permission from the landowner. And again, folks like me can help you figure out who you might need to partner with on a local level to get permission to do the work that you want to do. Always wear gloves and outdoor clothing. It's good practice when you're handling plants to do that all the time. Humans have varying response when we touch different things in nature, just like mosquito bites, right? You probably know some people that respond, really severely to mosquito bites, and other people it doesn't really bother them much. It's the same with plants. Sometimes people can touch plants that are considered non-toxic, but sometimes get a little bit of a rash or irritation. So always a good idea to just protect yourself. And there are other hazards in nature that you should be aware of, environmental hazards. So perhaps there's nesting birds or wildlife that might be using an area, and so that might not be a great time for you to be in there. But also safety hazards, so different terrain, especially in our region, we've got so many ravines and slopes, and those are often areas where invasives will grow, but they're a little bit more dangerous for us to be in. Working on roadsides, property boundaries, just making sure that you're really aware of the area that you're working in. I also encourage people to work as a team. If you're not able to get out in, a small group, make sure that somebody knows where you are and have a check-in policy. With my crew, we often work by ourselves, and so we have a working alone policy where we kind of check in with each other at the beginning and the end of the day, and we always know where everybody's going to be working. So that could be a family member, it could be a fellow volunteer, but I encourage you to make sure that people are with you or that they know where you are. Also, great idea to collect data. So much great work is happening, but people don't often document what they're doing. So I encourage you to write down, when you were out there, what you collected, how much you collected, how much area you cleared, and even document by photos if you can. So before and after photos are really great to provide that sort of history of what's happened at the site. And then, of course, we don't want to be spreading these invasive plants as we're removing them. So try and prevent the spread of seeds and plant parts as much as possible. So disposal, I mentioned I was going to touch on this. Disposal procedures are completely regional specific. So generally in Metro Vancouver, small quantities of invasive plants, as long as they're not toxic, are fine to go into our yard waste. So most municipal green waste bins go to industrial facilities that are processing the material at a high enough temperature for a long enough period of time that it will kill all of the material. However, if it is a toxic plant like spurge laurel or Daphne laurel or giant hogweed, we don't want any staff at any of these facilities to come in contact with that material. And so there's other protocol that I can share if that's relevant to the work that you're doing. Of course, we don't want people dumping garden waste into any streams or natural areas or rights of ways. That's actually illegal. And it's how invasives have often spread in the first place. And also not recommended to put invasive plants into your home composter because again, they'll likely just thrive in that kind of environment and just take off on you. So if you are working as part of a stewardship group, hopefully you have a connection with the local government or whoever your partner is, and they will be able to help you with disposal, whether they're going to come and pick it up for you or whether they place a bid at the site. There's lots of different ways that that's managed in the region, but definitely it's something that you can get some support on. Gardening best practices, if you're doing this just on your own time, on your own space, know what you grow. So don't just accept seeds or plants for someone, and don't just buy random things off the internet, because you can nowadays. When possible, use weed-free sources. So check out the plant material that you're buying. Read the ingredients on the wildflower seed mix that you might be introducing. And of course, try and manage your invasives. If you absolutely need to have invasives on your property, try and keep them indoors or contain them in a garden bed or some kind of container. Or as in the photo there, you can pull off the flowers before they go to seed. And certainly if you have to have them on your property, please only grow those that already exist in your region and not bring something from somewhere else, because you don't want to be responsible for bringing the newest, worst invasive plant into your region. One of the best resources in Metro Vancouver is a regional district guide. It's the growgreenguide.ca. So for information about how to design a space, whether it's a little raised bed or whether it's a large garden or yard, there's tons of great information on there about how to design your space and how to find the right plant. There's tons of cool resources on there. So I highly encourage you to check that out. Here is some ways that you can contact me after today. So I'll have my email address on the final slide, but I welcome any of you to contact me after today, whether it's to just get contact information for somebody else, or if you have a direct question, you can visit my website for more information. And like many of you, we are also on social media, so you can follow us that way. So some of the take-home messages. First of all, thank you so much for those of you that are stewarding your own space and natural areas. I'm just always emotional that there are folks that care as much as I do about doing great work. And I hope that you've learned a little something today to help make your jobs a little bit easier. Connect with invasive species experts in your region. I'd love to hear from you again, or I can get you in touch with people just like me who would be welcome to hear from you. There are really resources available for any project. So if you have any questions about anything, if I don't know the answer, I'll likely be able to find something and can point you in the right direction. And please help spread the word, not the weed. So part of how you can help and be an ally in the cause to minimize the impact of invasives is to help spread the word, right? Let your neighbor know who might be harboring an invasive plant. Let your friends and family know, and share the great work that you're doing. Just a reminder that the workshop is being recorded. So after today, Grace will be sending everybody who's registered an email with all the links to the resources shared, as well as a link to the recording. So I'll need a few days to get that up online, but please do expect that from her at some point. And then I wanted to end with some upcoming events. So let me be the first to say happy Invasive Species Action Month. We're not quite into May, but May is Invasive Species Action Month in BC. And it's been a proclamation from the provincial government for a number of years now. So those of us that do this work try and use May to really promote activities and learning. And so if you go to the bcinvasives.ca site there, you'll be able to see different events that are happening around the province and different toolkits and resources. Also, if you're super into invasive species and you don't have a day job that would prevent you from attending, I'm hosting a free online spring forum on May 6th from 10:30 to noon. And so we have a couple of guest speakers, somebody from the city of Vancouver who's going to provide an update on the Japanese beetle eradication program. So that's a very invasive beetle that was found in 2017. So there's been this huge response to try and get rid of that beetle. And then we also have a researcher who's going to talk about a targeted grazing feasibility study that she worked on for the reason. So targeted grazing is a cultural control method using livestock like goats or something to manage invasive species. So she's going to talk about what she learned about whether that would be an appropriate tool for managing invasives here in Metro Vancouver. So you can go to our events page and register for that right now if that's interesting to you. As soon as I'm finished, Grace is going to mention some of the events that she's got coming up through the Free the Fern. And finally, a couple of events that I'm excited to share. We've started a community art plant series. So our first workshop was last week, but we have 2 more workshops coming up. And the whole idea is to encourage people to document plants in their neighborhood. So on May 19th, we have a photographer that will be teaching people online how to take good plant photos. And then on June 16th, we'll be having an artist come to do a little workshop on how to draw or paint plants. And then a great outcome of this project is we're actually going to be putting together a little plant ID guide. And so participants of the workshops are actually invited to submit photos or artwork that they've taken to actually be included in a little plant ID guide. It's not going to be professionals contributing the artwork. It's going to be community members, which is really cool. So here is my contact information. So if you want to get me directly, that's my phone line and my email address. And as well as, again, thanking Grace and all of her funders, I would also like to acknowledge the financial assistance of the province of BC, which allows my organization to do outreach like this to the public. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Grace, who has a few words to share before we move into the question and answer period.
All right. I just wanted to share a couple events that I am going to be doing with Free the Fern. So the first one we're doing is called an Art for Plants fundraiser. We've been hand painting art of local birds, animals, and plants, and making 5x7 canvases. These are going to be fundraisers for planting along the Champlain Heights Trail. So 100% of profits we raise are going to be used for planting native plants along the trails in South Vancouver. And we're selling the canvases for $15 each or 3 for $40. So they're very, very affordable, but it's going for a great cause, and we're going to be planting in the fall. And we also have another exciting event coming up that a lot of you might be interested in attending. I haven't made a poster for it yet because it's so new coming up. So in follow-up to this virtual workshop, I'm actually wanting to do a hands-on, in-person learning workshop on invasive removal techniques. So this will be following the COVID protocols. So we'll be able to host up to 24 participants in a staggered session on June 12th. So that's a Saturday, June 12th. And it will be located at the area right near where I am living, which is South Vancouver, Champlain Heights neighborhood, along the Champlain Heights Trail. So we're going to be learning specifically how to remove English ivy, Himalayan blackberry, and common periwinkle by literally doing the removal and learning how to do it with the actual plants that are located right behind where I live. So that is something you can sign up for. I'll send out info to your email after this presentation, and you can learn about signing up for that on June 12th. And those are my 2 events. And I think we're going to move to questions. Is that right now, Tasha?
Let's move into questions. So yeah, Grace has been following the chat more closely than I have. It's hard to talk and read at the same time. So please go ahead and
okay.
Let's see.
I thought I would start with some more general ones, and then we'll move on to specific questions about specific species, just so it might relate more to more people if we go with the general first. So a good question is, I'm curious if you have a response to the comments about keeping these invasive species. What do you say when someone says this is an environmental issue and this is following Darwin's survival of the fittest for a warmer, drier climate? So I'm assuming they're asking if someone's defending keeping an invasive in the area, how do you respond to someone who makes a comment while you're doing removal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really tough. And one of the phrases that people use when people bring up this perspective is the term novel ecosystem. So it's sort of like, yeah, these invaders have come here and they've been able to survive and reproduce. And so a novel ecosystem is just sort of letting the ecosystem be the way it is. I think for me, I mean, having done this work for so long, I know that we're not ever going to get rid of all invasive species. We might eradicate a few, but unfortunately, more things seem to get added to the lists and things getting off the list. And so, you know, I prioritize, you know, some of those really high priority species that are having really big impacts on the environment or just our ability to live our lives in the way that we want to. And so there are tons of people that are out there that want help with their invasives. And so I see my role as really helping them to do that better. But I think, yeah, there's sort of that philosophical issue that people sometimes talk about, but because we know that this issue is largely because of human intervention, there's a few species that have been you know, not introduced by humans, but largely this whole phenomenon, this issue is because of humans. And so I feel like it's sort of our duty to do what we can to, you know, kind of, you know, boost ecosystems and make a difference. And, you know, we're not going to make it all the way. There's always going to be pressure from invasives, but I think there's a lot of merit in still, you know, kind of fighting the good fight. And I think it's, you know, to do this job, you really need to be an optimist at heart, but there's so many great examples of success stories where work has happened and, you know, people have done good work and have made a difference for, you know, the environment or a species at risk or something like that. And so I've seen firsthand that it can be effective. And so, yeah, sometimes those people that bring that perspective up, it's really hard to change their mind. But I always sort of fall back on, I know that I'm helping people do the work that they want to do, and I've seen that it makes a difference. And so I continue supporting the work.
Yeah, thank you. I just to add to that, I would often draw people's attention to the damage that the invasive might be doing, like growing up a tree, and we can see that the ivy is killing these trees, like to see the detriment it's causing in the local area. So they see that there's a benefit to removing to help reestablish balance within that ecosystem and preserve the current trees and wildlife that are there. So, and sometimes I think just emphasizing with saying, yeah, it looks like it's nice and green, and it looks like there's a plant that's well established and it's very green, but sort of seeing their perspective, but also providing, I guess, a bit of education on green isn't always good, and like there's many forms of green that are not native to this area and meant to be in this space. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add too, I'm definitely not a proponent of everybody removing all invasives all at once, all the time. Like, we just don't have enough time and resources. And so part of my job is to help people prioritize, like, what can you do with your limited resources? And so, you know, often it's not managing the blackberry. Maybe it is, if that's all you have, or if that's the dominant species that's impacting value for that site, but often it's not. So invasive species experts are not necessarily advocating for removing everything. You know, we really have to take kind of an integrated approach when we make decisions. And so that's really helpful too.
Okay. Next question. What species do you recommend that would benefit birds, bees, and other native wildlife species?
Sure. I'm actually going to share my screen. So you guys can see my web browser there. So I just happen to have the Hedge Bindweed Best Management Guide up. And I just want to draw your attention to the restoration section. So no matter what plant guide you're picking, there's always all the sections are the same. So there's a restoration section, which is specific to hedge bindweed. However, this table here is fairly generic in all of them. And this is sort of my go-to list for native plants that are beneficial to wildlife that would be successfully introduced at a restoration site. And they're kind of categorized by wet, moist to dry sites, depending on what that might look like. And so these are really my best examples of native plants that would not only do well, but would provide great benefit. And really a lot of native plants will do that. It's just really hard to source all of the native plants that are out there. These ones tend to be readily available at garden centers. You may have to dig a little bit further, but these ones are also ones that are typical on, planting lists and, professional kind of restoration sites. So that's also a good place to go because they're easy to source.
Okay. And then someone else is asking, where can we see a list of stewardship groups and contact info for them?
Oh, that is a really, really great question. There isn't anything like that exactly. The best thing to do is to message me afterwards and tell me where you live or where you want to work, and I'll just I just know where some of those stewardship groups are working. We have a lot of different kinds of groups. So we have streamkeeper groups, we have friends of parks groups like Friends of Cypress Park. We also have, just grassroots organizations like Grace, where they're just stewarding like their own kind of neighborhood. Sometimes the city will offer stewardship opportunities. We happen to do stewardship work for New Westminster and for Burnaby, and so I'm very familiar with the events that are offered in those regions. So unfortunately, that's something that I should add to my to-do list, is having a list of all those, but the best thing probably is just to let me know where you want to work and I can send you the contact information.
The closest thing I found to that that's more informal is like it's called Park People. It's TD by TD, and if you go on Park People, because I recently got a Park People grant from TD, they have a map of Canada, and you can look at your area, and people register their stewardship groups on Park People, and you can see what ones are in your area. Like Free the Fern is registered on there, and there's quite a number in Vancouver that are registered on Park People. And they have a little bio section on each one on like who they are. So you can kind of look through there. I'm not sure they would include everything that Tasha has on her own list, but people can register themselves on Park People. So that's another option.
If you look up your local government, sometimes the cities will list active groups, but I find they're not always accurate. There's always usually a few more that I have to add to that list as well. So yeah, some good places to start.
Okay, and then are there good inexpensive sources for native plants like sword ferns for replanting areas on municipal or private property once invasives are removed?
Yes, I'm actually gonna share my screen again. There's a few slides that I didn't present, but I will now. So this is kind of a good place to start if you're looking for places to source or find lists of native plants. So the South Coast Conservation Program is actually a species at risk focus group, but they have a really cool resource called Diversity by Design. There's lots of great information in there about how to do restoration projects. So the BMP native plants table is the one that I just showed. There's also the Native Plant Society of BC. Their lists of retailers aren't always up to date, but it's a really good place to start. There's a PDF document you can find on there that has suggested retailers, nurseries, and also seed suppliers. And I think they're kind of categorized by region. And again, you can just ask me specifically for commercial retailers. Unfortunately, many of our great native plant suppliers will only supply to commercial projects. But there are some local nurseries that I know of that, will have a better selection of native plants than, say, your average plant retailer. But yeah, it can be really hard to source native plants. There's plants that I would love to have planted over the years, but nobody's selling them. If anybody wants to go into the plant growing business. If you focus on native plants, you might have a good business model there.
Just to jump in there, if people have a budget of a minimum of $500, you can do an order through, it's called Nat's Nursery, and it's through Langley, and it's a big distributor that distributes like native plants, and like the Parks Board gets plants from them for planting in the parks. And I'm doing a big order from them to do a native plant teaching garden for the fall. So Nats, N-A-T-S, Nat's Nursery, if you just look that up, they have almost every native plant you can look for, but you have to pay a minimum of $500 order. So if it's a small project for your garden, that probably wouldn't work. People pair up with someone else maybe and then do a bigger order together though. So.
And Nats is who we mostly use for our bigger projects as well. And they don't actually have a retail store, so you can't actually go there. Well, unless you already pre-made an order like Grace would do. They do delivery as well, but yeah, I would encourage you, if there's anybody else in your neighborhood that's interested in the same thing, if you can go together. Nats probably has the best selection of native plants, and they're just out in the valley, so they're close.
Mm-hmm. This next one is more of a comment, but it's really pertinent, especially to my area, and I really wanted to mention it. So their comment is, I'd like to see the city be more proactive in discouraging people from making natural green belts in Champlain Heights and elsewhere prettier by transplanting their garden shrubs and flowers into what was intended to be a native area. So I think it's more of a comment on the city should be more proactive in discouraging a place that should be a natural space, a wild native space, becoming like people are making it a garden space, and having regulations maybe against planting non-native plants within strips of forested areas. I don't know if there is any regulation.
I would support that as well. I don't know for sure, but there's probably some kind of bylaw infraction that would be committed when people do that. However, of all the things that happen in parks, it's probably low priority, and enforcement is always the issue. I mean, same with invasive plants. Some of the plants that I covered, they're considered regulated noxious weeds under the BC Weed Control Act. So technically, if people have them on their property, they're required to manage them. However, enforcement is just not really common. It's extremely rare in BC for anybody to be slapped with a bylaw notice or a provincial infraction because they have a noxious weed on their property. So yeah, and I think more education probably needs to be done. People are becoming more aware of like not dumping, or throwing trash into parks. But I think there's still a gap where people think, I'm going to plant my whatever for my garden. There's a site that I'm working at in Central Park right now where entire sections of some ponds are taken over by daylilies, the daylilies that you find in people's yards or gardens. And it's just like overtaking the bank, and people probably think that it's really beautiful, but it's like, it's kind of becoming really invasive. And so I think there's not a lot of awareness that people definitely should not be planting anything in natural areas unless they have permission and they're part of a group like Grace's.
Okay, a lot of the other questions are specific about removing specific types of weeds. So there's several questions about removing buttercup. I don't know if you have any commentary specifically on buttercup and removal.
Buttercup is probably the worst plant in my garden. I have a minor shoulder injury that I've had for about a year, and I'm pretty sure it's from pulling creeping buttercup, which is terrible in the lawn and in gardens. And yeah, I mean, it does spread vegetatively. You probably, if you're dealing with it, you've noticed that there's like the original plant, but then it'll send out kind of a runner and then create a new plant. And they also tend to really congregate or grow in areas where there's a bit of retained water. So against retaining walls or pathways and that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, just trying to remove it as fast as they come up. But I know it's a losing battle in my yard, especially around a lot of my garden bed edges. I can't get it all, and it's competing with my strawberries. So I hear you, super difficult to control, just hand pulling and trying to get out the roots as much as you can. And maybe to prevent injury like I have, maybe using some kind of little hoe or trowel instead of just using your hands might make it a little bit easier to kind of pop the whole plant out of the ground. And then obviously trying to get at it before it produces flower, because it will spread worse by seed if those yellow flowers form and then they're able to go to seed.
Okay. And specific suggestions for controlling bindweed, are these questions like that you'd refer to looking at those best practice guides maybe for that, or?
Yeah, I think I noticed that there was a question about field bindweed. So the best management guide that we have is for hedge bindweed, which is this plant. However, if you go to the hedge bindweed section, there's actually a picture of field bindweed under the similar species. So field bindweed is the one on the left there. They would both be managed in very similar ways. They're both invasive. Field bindweed tends to be a little bit more problematic in agriculture areas, so in crops and pastures and fields. But this guide would be beneficial for both of those species. Yeah.
Okay. And then I don't know if you have any recommendation on what would you recommend to replace weeds such as dandelion, plantains, buttercup, etc. in a dry, hot spot with poor soil. If there are any, I suppose, native plants, I'm assuming, that would do well in dry, hot soil. Hardy native plants, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I thought a retailer, a good nursery would probably be able to answer the question better than I would. In a situation like that, like dry, sandy soils are not the greatest for native plants. So you might even need to consider a non-native, non-invasive, like a wildflower or something that's going to be from a seed package that doesn't contain any invasives, but that might do well in that kind of area. I've got, in my garden, there's kind of a drier area where I've planted like lady's mantle or a geum. I don't know the species name. And so those are not native plants, but they're plants that, might do well in that kind of environment. So when you go to the nursery, I think it's fine to have non-native plants in your yard. You just want to be sure not to get the invasives one. So bring a little brochure or bring your iPhone with you so you can look stuff up when you're looking at plant labels and ask questions of the people and say, this is the kind of environment I have. They're really good at, finding the right plant for you, and just make sure that they're not suggesting an invasive plant. And if they do, and if they're selling them, then you can give them a piece of your mind as well and share what you know about invasives and ask them why they're selling them.
Another good general one is, what tools or gloves do you recommend to use in removing invasives from blackberries, hogweed to ivy? You can make a comment and I can share something I've noticed too about what I use, but if you have any specific recommendations.
You start.
Well, in terms of general tools that are really good, there's these pruners called Fiskars. They're like the common popular brand name. You can get them at Canadian Tire. They're around $24.99, and when they're on sale, maybe $18 or so. Fiskars, and they're really, really good and sharp. They work well. I've used them all in Evercrawley Park and in the trails for blackberry removal, and they stay pretty sharp. So they're really good. In terms of gloves, I actually go through gloves so fast that I actually have turned to just using dollar store gardening gloves now, because I spent so much money on like these nice gardening gloves, and when you're out there removing a lot of invasives, your gloves wear out so fast. Even if they're like, I haven't found a magic bullet brand that's like the perfect for general gardening gloves. For blackberry removal, I first went and got rose gloves that were really sort of high-end, long sleeve, fancy rose gloves, really expensive. And then it got a hole in the finger and had to use duct tape and patch it up and all this stuff. And then I heard from other people who had been just using leather working gloves that are at the dollar store. They're like standard work gloves. They go about to here, and they're made of leather, and they're $5.99. And since I found those are just as good for me as were the expensive gloves that I bought. And if they do wear out, I don't feel so bad that I spent $40 on gloves or something. So sometimes just getting some strong stick leather type work gloves I find works best. That works best for me. I don't know about what you think, Tasha? But
I don't have any particular brand to recommend, but generally with plants that are thorny, yeah, a pair of thick leather gloves will work, although I don't think I've ever heard of any particular type that is totally blackberry thorn proof. I sort of tend to do what Grace does. I tend to use sort of the cheaper gloves. And I just, you know, kind of sacrifice my skin, and I'm going to get a few pokes sometimes. As far as tools, you know, really my favorite tool, Larissa's going to laugh at me. Thank you for unloading these from the truck so that I could show them. But this is like possibly a tree planting shovel or smaller. It just has a really small spade on the bottom. And honestly, when I'm doing gardening in my own yard and with blackberries, I often have a little clippers in one of my pockets, but this shovel like this is kind of my go-to. It's a really light shovel. I'm not a super strong or large person, and so I don't like carrying around a big shovel. But even when I'm getting out my buttercup and stuff, like just having a little tiny shovel like that to just pop stuff out of the ground to just get it started, and then using your gloved hands to pull the rest of the way, and then clippers in case, you know, there's a really long branch or something you need to cut. That's really what I use. Like my shovel is probably the most important tool that I use. Yeah, another tip, I haven't actually used them, but one of the volunteer groups that we work with a number of years ago, one of the volunteers, she actually repurposed old pants, and she made these kind of sleeves. And so it was a way for people to further protect themselves from the blackberry. Whether they were wearing short sleeves or not, they could put on these kind of modified like pants over their arms, and then there were kind of cuffs to hold it up, and then gloves. And that was a way that people could protect their entire arm if they were doing blackberry. And this particular group was kind of focusing on blackberry. So that was just another protective layer that they were using. But you could use something very similar. I always wear like long sleeves and long pants. I'm very fair skinned, so I burn from the sun really easily. So that's another reason why I like to cover up. But when I'm working around plants, even in my own garden, unless it's really, really hot, I always wear long sleeves just because I don't want to get injured.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to show these are what I'm meaning by work gloves. So these are just like $5.99 dollar store work gloves, and they're actually leather. So they're pretty good and they work well. And then just for general gardening gloves, these are also just $4.99 from the dollar store. Like I go through these so fast. And in terms of like blackberry, I think it's just careful removal. Like when I take a strand of blackberry, I cut the blackberry strand and cut it into smaller pieces to dispose of it. And then I take my shovel and I dig out the root, but I'm not just grabbing at lots of blackberry branches, and I'm not trying to get thick into the thicket, getting deep into it so I scrape my arms or legs. I usually keep quite a distance, and I just take one branch at a time and very carefully like cut that one. So it's not, I kind of learned the hard way about like scratching up my arms before, and so now I try to be a little more kind of delicate with it, I guess. But yeah, a big shovel is important. Like a shovel for digging out the roots is essential for blackberry. You really need to get those roots out if you want to get it working well for you.
Just okay. Yeah, more tip about the gloves. Gloves are kind of like shoes. Almost even more important than the type of glove is you want to get a good fit. So if you're in the garden center or the dollar store, like if you can, try it and see if it fits, because if you have a good fit, that'll make your job so much easier. There's nothing worse than having gloves that are too small and they don't even come up all the way to where your fingers meet your hand, or if they're too big, then it's just no good either.
Definitely. Okay, there's some more questions that are specific to people's different properties. I mean, if we have the time now, we could ask specific property type questions. So for example, hi, we have a raised bed where morning glory seems to pop up through the soil. Do we need to dig out these beds in order to tackle the invasion, or just continue to dig them out as they come for morning glory?
Yeah, my advice is the latter. Just continue to dig them out. There are certain parts of my garden where I don't have raised beds, but I kind of have raised mounds of soil. And every year I'm kind of like, okay, I'm determined to like get the bindweed out of a certain section, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't seem to matter how far down I dig out. There's always bindweed coming back at that site. So I'm kind of convinced that is just something that you're probably going to have to live with. I think it's extremely difficult to get rid of all of it. Unfortunately, yeah, I think you're not probably ever going to get rid of it.
Yeah, that's probably one of the most frustrating of the invasives.
Yeah, don't spend so much time digging through the entire bed, because I feel like it will probably still come back anyway. So.
And I think spring is one of the most discouraging seasons, although it's really beautiful, because you take out all the invasives in the winter and you're like, I got them all out. And then you come back and you're like, oh, everything's coming back. And it's all coming back again. And you're like, but it was all gone. Why are they all back? And then you're out there and you feel like you're starting over, pulling them out again. And you're like, yeah. Let's see. Someone says, I live on a steep property that's covered by pretty much every invasive plant you've mentioned. Wow. What are some native plants that might help stabilize steep hillside landscapes? Steep hillside.
It might stabilize steep hillside. Well, yeah, when we do restoration plantings, again, it totally depends on the site, but my preference is to plant a few trees. One of the ways that you can cut down on the number of invasives you have is to shade them out. But of course, you can't install, huge trees and mature shrubs, but you can, try and get there within a few years. So I would definitely encourage, if the property is suitable, to plant some trees and then also some shrubs. And then hopefully over time, as they get more mature, they'll start to help kind of outcompete with some of those invasives. But yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe your property would be a great place to do like a site tour or a guided walk sometime. All those invasives, yeah.
So that's what I joke about on the site I'm working on. I'm like, I want to make a native plant teaching garden, but right now it's an invasive plant teaching garden. Like that's why I want to host a hands-on session there in June, because I was like, it's such a great site to walk through and be like, here's this invasive and that one and that one. And in a small area, you can see such a wide variety of invasives. It's a good learning opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay, and someone had a specific question about if we want to remove invasives that are around bus shelters, do we need to contact Coast Mountain Bus Company or TransLink?
Yes. Yes, you do. Or you could maybe talk to the city. The city might have jurisdiction over those sites. I don't know exactly. So jurisdiction is basically property boundaries. I don't know where the property boundaries start and end with like a city versus, the transit authority, whether it's like where the bus shelter ends. But I know in many cases, cities are responsible for maintaining, sidewalks and garbage cans in public areas and all that. So they, may actually be maintaining the area around the bus stops as well as, the wider sidewalk. So if there's an area that you're interested in stewarding, it might be easier to start with the city. Also, yeah, I have a few contacts at TransLink, but I wouldn't even know who would be best to contact. I don't know whether they have, regional managers or area managers. So again, the city might be more likely to have, a direct contact that you could find at TransLink to kind of see what's happening there. And they may not give permission to do work like that, but even just drawing their attention to areas that need work, whether it's invasives or not, can also go a long way too. Larissa and I are working on some projects this year where literally the reason why a certain site or priority species was, funded in a certain year is because one person, called or complained or has been, trying to make headway with the city to get something done on a certain site. So I encourage you, I don't work for government, so it's easy for me to say if you have concerns about something that you're seeing and you would like to see more action and you have knowledge about what needs to be done, but I'm a huge proponent of writing letters or nowadays emails, I guess, and expressing your concerns and requesting that, work get done.
Okay, I don't know what our time frame is. What is our goal for finishing our session?
Yeah, maybe another 10 minutes or so.
Okay, just so we can field some more questions. Okay, there's a lot of questions here. So why are nurseries and garden centers being allowed to sell all these invasive plants like ivy? Why are they allowed to do that?
Yeah, it's a really great
question.
Yeah, super frustrating for somebody like me because, it'd be a lot easier than trying to educate everybody about what are the appropriate plants than if there was legislation. So what I know is that it's not illegal right now. So the responsibility for legislation for these kinds of things lies with the provincial government. And a lot of the legislation, there's like pieces of a few bits of legislation that govern invasive species in BC, but they're not great. A lot of them came from really old pieces of legislation. And what I've heard is that there is kind of a more holistic piece of legislation called the Invasive Species Act, which would include all invasive species and would have a bit more kind of legislative teeth. However, that is not, it hasn't currently been passed. It hasn't even been brought to Parliament yet. And I don't know when it will be, if it'll be in the lifetime of my career. But I am hopeful that at some point legislation will change so that it'll be more difficult for people to sell and maintain and grow and trade and give away these invasives. But right now, that's not currently the case. And yeah, I would support stronger legislation. Another thing that we've been told by the provincial government is that it would be a huge blow to the industry if suddenly we came out with a list of you cannot sell these things. There's a lot of complexities about how plants are sold here. One example is, if you buy plants at Canadian Tire, a local Canadian Tire staff person didn't decide that. It's like somebody in head office in Toronto that's making decisions about what plants are going to be sold years in advance for across Canada. So there's a bit of a problem in just how these organizations and corporations are structured that don't make it easy to suddenly make a big change. However, my response to industry is going to be impacted is that people aren't going to buy less plants, they're just going to buy the right plants. So suddenly if English ivy was banned and that wasn't a huge thing, then there'd be replacement, there would be a niche market for alternative plants. I do understand their perspective, but I also am disappointed about how slow legislation is to change in BC. It's much faster in the United States, where things get added and taken off lists very quickly, and those lists are enforced, and there's kind of legislative teeth to kind of make it work.
I just wondered.
Like Brenda has a question. Yeah, go ahead, Brenda.
Wondered about a petition. They go round and they go round, but at least it's a large group, and you seem so connected, Tasha, and we're here now. So maybe we could even just start with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the best thing to do, because we're probably all from different regions, is to start talking to your MLA, so your member of the Legislative Assembly, which is your representative for provincial government. It's really provincial jurisdiction that we're talking about. And so if our elected officials knew that this was important, I think that will make a difference. Every year there's a committee called the Standing Committee on Finance, which accepts delegations and letters, and it's all about what's going to be in the budget for the following fiscal year. And so people like me write letters and do presentations sometimes together, and we have these consistent messages that we've come up with. And so we know that government is listening, but I think we need more, folks like you guys to also, be talking and saying this is important to us, and we demand that there be some better legislation to kind of ban the sale of these things, because it seems like such a simple fix, and yet without that, every year there's new invaders coming in, and it just it's becoming more difficult to kind of keep up. So write a letter. Yeah.
I find there's a lot of power in positive action too, like in terms of talking to people. Like, for example, in my neighborhood, I just heard that a whole giant co-op, housing co-op, has committed to taking out all the invasives within their co-op and planting native plants within their whole co-op. And that was because we've been talking to them about it, and there's various members in the co-op who are in our Free the Fern group who are advocating for native planting and invasive removal, and their whole co-op has made a mandate to do this. And so that can spread. So I think there's power in just positive action, like not always like fighting against the growers and things like that, or the distributors, but also just positively sharing information in your community, being positive action, representing like what's possible, and then sharing that with other people. And hopefully it has a ripple effect where other people in your community start to notice that, and they're like, wow, what are you doing over here? You're taking out all the ivy, what is going on here? And they start to learn, and then they go back home, and then they tell someone at their home, right? Like it's a positive ripple effect. And I'm seeing that along where we're living. It's rippling down the trail, and people in different townhouses along the trail are making positive action to remove invasives now. So it's just spreading. So, and people can educate each other, like, why are we not buying the invasives to come into our co-op? You know, so it's a positive movement. It's surprising how effective it is, though. Like, I didn't think action like that could happen, and then it's just happening organically. Like, people are changing, and policies are changing within their own, like, townhouses. It's amazing to see. So sometimes, like, live and be the change. And like, if you're out there removing invasives wherever you're at, talk to people. Like, people come by and they're like, why are you doing this? Talk to them, and people go home and tell other people, right? It's a positive movement, right? So, yeah.
One thing that I really advocate for is signage. So one of the projects that Larissa and I are working at is this site, Glenbrook Ravine in the city of New West. And there's been this large volunteer contingent for years clearing the site. But unless you are a member of the public walking by during the 3 hours once a month when the volunteers are there, you wouldn't necessarily know how to get involved or what's happening. And so this year I'm so excited because they actually installed like permanent signage. And by permanent, I mean fairly inexpensive, just like plastic signs that say, this is a restoration project, here's how to get involved. And I love that because now there's this kind of legacy, and anybody using the park can see what's happening and get involved. And so, you know, you could do that on your own backyard fence, but I love when there's opportunity to actually put up some signage to explain to people like, hey, did you know that this area, you know, was once, you know, invaded by blackberry, or whatever the message is. It's just another way to kind of connect with people, engage with people, even when you're not there at the site.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good suggestion. And then someone shared a positive story. Champlain Heights residents got together a few years ago with a community neighborhood grant and had an ivy pull and basket weaving day, and it was really cool. And I still have my basket. So that's a cool use of the ivy. I always comment on that when I'm like taking out the ivy. Why can't we use this for something? I mean, I wish I could have someone who could teach me to make a basket out of it. That would be such a great future workshop we could do. That would be good. I think that's most of the questions that I've covered. If I didn't cover your question, I'm sorry. And if you have specific questions for Tasha, you can also send her an email, and she'll answer any really specific questions you have for your site you're working on as well. And I really want to say thank you to Tasha for coming out and doing this session, for all of us who came to watch and learn from this. And the turnout today was amazing. All the participation and all the interest from the community is just, it's amazing to see that, that passion for removal of invasives. It's, like I say, it's spreading. It's spreading in a good way, not like an invasive spread, but it's a positive spread of action in our communities. And like I say, it'll happen, it'll keep spreading. People will see the action you're doing. And I really want to say thank you to all of you for doing removal effort. It takes a lot of actual physical work. Like Tasha says, there's no quick fix. It's physical labor. There's no way around it. Like, you're going to be doing physical labor to remove these invasives. But as I say, it's a labor of love. For me, it's been a labor of love because I can see so much benefit. Like, as I see I'm removing things, I'm seeing, for example, ferns. We're called Free the Fern because we actually have freed many ferns from blackberry and ivy when we were removing, and just seeing them coming to life and growing. And it's been so satisfying, such satisfying work out there. So I want to say good luck to everybody on your own site where you're working. Like, good luck with your effort and your removal effort, and don't give up if if it's hard, it's going to be several years often to remove a site and keep it clear and come back and remove again. And but don't give up, and it is worth the work you're doing. So it's a good effort, it's a good cause, and plant native plants as well when you remove. So Tasha, do you want to say any last things before we?
No, just thanks again to you. You really are the reason why we're all here, and I'm just amazed at what you've been able to accomplish in such a short period of time. And it's just been such a pleasure working with you, and I am looking forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you.
Come out there to the site. I know we talked about that, but I will get out there this spring. Yeah.
Oh, you have to come out. I mean, maybe when we do or before we do our hands-on removal, you can come out and see what it looks like now and what we've been doing with it. Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. And yes, as Grace mentioned, good luck with the work that you're doing.
And I'll be sending out the links with all the information that's been shared, as well as the video link to this video after it's ready to be shared. And if you have anything to comment or connect with me, please reach out to me via my email address. And thank you everybody for coming, and have a great night tonight.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you.